They say no man in history ever bent the world to his will as quickly, or as violently as Alexander of Macedon. He lived only 32 years, yet in that brief flash of existence, he shattered empires older than his own ancestors, marched farther than any general before him, and carved a kingdom stretching from Greece to India. Beneath the myths, the statues, the hero worship, lies a far more complex truth. Alexander was not simply a conqueror. He was a boy raised on prophecy, a king forged in blood, a general driven by ambition so vast it bordered on madness. And in the end, the greatest empire in the world could not satisfy the hunger inside him. Tonight, we will peel back the layers of legend. We will follow Alexander from his first breath to his final fever, from the hills of Macedon to the scorching deserts of Persia, from youthful brilliance to the chaotic shadow of his final days. This is not just the story of a general. This is the story of a man who tried to outrun mortality. This is Alexander the Great. Before Alexander's birth, the world trembled in uncertainty. Greek city-states tore one another apart in endless wars. Persia ruled the east with a heavy and ancient hand, and Macedonia, once dismissed as a land of hill tribes, had just risen under a king more dangerous than any Greek had expected. Into this boiling cauldron of ambition, prophecy, and blood came a child surrounded by omens. Aristotle would teach him that the world was knowable. Philip II would teach him that the world was conquerable. His mother, Olympias, would teach him that the world was destined for him. And Alexander believed all three. Everything you are about to hear is part of a single, unstoppable chain of events that led a 20-year-old boy barely more than a prince to crush armies, dethrone kings, reshape continents, and walk into legend. This is not the sanitized story told in textbooks. This is the real Alexander, ambitious, brilliant, ruthless, visionary, flawed, and terrifying. The world before Alexander, Greece in chaos. Before Alexander ever drew breath, Greece was a broken land. A century earlier, the Greeks had united just long enough to hold back the massive armies of Persia, but unity was a luxury they quickly abandoned. In the decades that followed, the Greek world dissolved into bitter rivalries, betrayals, and wars that lasted generations. Athens and Sparta, the two great superpowers, destroyed one another in the Peloponnesian War, leaving behind a landscape littered with ruins, bankrupt cities, and men who no longer believed in peace. Into this fractured stage, Macedonia had quietly risen from contempt to dominance. The Greeks viewed Macedonians as half-barbarians from the mountains. Yet by the time Alexander was born, Macedonia had become the most organized military force in the region. Philip II, Alexander's father, had transformed a rough tribal kingdom into a disciplined war machine. He invented the Macedonian phalanx as we know it, armed his soldiers with long sarissas that outreached every Greek spear, and used diplomacy with the same sharpness as any sword. Greece was exhausted, but Philip was not. He saw opportunity in the ashes of Greek pride. By the mid-4th century BCE, Greek independence was a fading dream. Many cities had been forced into alliances they hated, others had been stripped of power, and the Persian Empire watched from the east, amused by the endless Greek quarrels. The stage was set for someone new, someone young, hungry, and utterly fearless to step into the vacuum left by generations of conflict. The Greek world was ready for domination, even if it didn't know it yet. But the world Alexander inherited was not only politically broken, it was spiritually uncertain. Old heroes like Achilles and Heracles were worshipped more as myths than role models. Philosophers argued over the nature of truth, while common people starved. In many ways, the world was waiting for a figure powerful enough to unify it, or dangerous enough to burn it all down. Philip believed he was that figure. Olympias believed her son would surpass even the gods. And fate, if it existed, seemed to agree. Thus, before Alexander even opened his eyes, Greece was already collapsing into his future empire. The world that had once belonged to Athens and Sparta now waited unwillingly, unknowingly, for the arrival of a young Macedonian prince who would reshape history with the force of his will. The birth of Alexander, omens, prophecies, and divine claims. Alexander's birth was surrounded by stories so dramatic that even ancient historians could not resist. Writing them down, according to legend, on the very night Olympias conceived him, Philip was away at war and dreamed of sealing her womb with a lion-shaped omen that her child would be unstoppable, fierce, destined for greatness. Olympias herself claimed she dreamed of a thunderbolt striking her body, erupting into flames, and spreading out like fire across the world. In a culture obsessed with signs from the gods, this was no ordinary pregnancy. The poets whispered that Zeus himself had fathered the child, and that Olympias had been chosen to bear a king unlike any who had lived before. When Alexander was born in 356 BCE, the omens intensified. 3 great events reportedly occurred on the same night. The temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, mysteriously burned to the ground. Philip received news of a major military victory. Greece witnessed strange lights in the sky. Ancient writers could not resist interpreting these coincidences as cosmic announcements. They believed the world was shifting, reshaping itself in preparation for a ruler whose shadow would stretch across continents. Philip, hardened by war and ambition, viewed his newborn son with a mix of pride and calculation. A king needed more than noble blood, he needed destiny. So Philip embraced the omens. He allowed the Greek world to speculate that Alexander's lineage might reach beyond mortal men. Olympias, a woman fiercely protective of her son's greatness, encouraged the rumors that Zeus had visited her in the form of lightning. Whether these myths were true mattered less than the power they held. From birth, Alexander was taught not only that he could rule the world, but that he should. Growing up believing oneself divine can be dangerous, but it also builds an unbreakable sense of purpose. Alexander walked through childhood surrounded by priests, prophets, and storytellers who reinforced one idea again and again: he was chosen. The world was his inheritance. The heavens had marked him. And while some kings fought for legitimacy, Alexander never doubted his own. He believed destiny walked beside him. By the time he could speak, Alexander understood he was no ordinary prince. He was raised not simply to rule Macedonia, but to command the world beyond its borders. The omens of his birth had set a stage that even he would spend his entire life trying to live up to and surpass. Olympias and Philip II, a childhood of fire and ambition. Alexander's parents were 2 of the most powerful forces shaping his destiny, and they could not have been more different. Olympias, his mother, was a priestess of the cult of Dionysus, passionate, spiritual, unpredictable, and fiercely devoted to her son. She whispered into Alexander's ear that he was descended not from mortal kings, but from Achilles, the greatest hero of Greece, and from Zeus himself. Olympias fed his imagination with stories of divine lineage and heroic legacy until he believed them as deeply as he believed in his own heartbeat. Philip II, on the other hand, was the embodiment of ruthless practicality. He had fought, negotiated, bribed, and killed his way to the top of Macedonian power. Where Olympias filled Alexander's mind with mythic destiny, Philip filled it with military discipline, political realism, and strategy. Philip's court was a place of alliances and conspiracies, its rival generals and ambitious nobles, an environment where only the strongest minds and sharpest instincts survived. Alexander grew up watching his father reshape Greece, and he learned early that power belonged to those bold enough to seize it. Despite their differences, Olympias and Philip shared one thing: each believed Alexander could become greater than themselves. But their marriage was a battlefield. Olympias resented Philip's many wives and political marriages, fearing they threatened Alexander's right to the throne. Philip, meanwhile, saw Olympia's influence as dangerously close to fanaticism. Alexander grew up in the middle of this emotional war, learning from it the harsh lesson that loyalty was a currency, not a guarantee. The tension between his parents created a fire inside Alexander. From Olympias, he inherited intensity, passion, and a belief in destiny. From Philip, he inherited brilliance in strategy, leadership, and war. And from their conflict, he inherited mistrust, ambition, and the certainty that power must be taken before it is taken from you. These forces shaped him not just as a prince, but as the man who would reshape the ancient world. As Alexander grew into adolescence, he idolized Achilles not as a distant hero, but as a model to imitate. This obsession was fueled by Olympias, who insisted that Alexander's bloodline traced back to Achilles through her Malician ancestry. Philip, ever practical, mocked the myth, but encouraged his son's ambition nonetheless. He famously told Alexander, "Seek a kingdom worthy of yourself," knowing Macedonia was too small to contain the boy's hunger. By the time Alexander reached his teenage years, he was already being groomed not just for kingship, but for immortality. He carried within him the fire of two worlds, the divine dreams of his mother and the iron realism of his father. Both would shape the conqueror he would become. Tutored by Aristotle, philosophy, power, and purpose, Philip knew Alexander possessed fire, but fire without direction destroys everything it touches. So he brought in the greatest mind in Greece to shape the boy's spirit, Aristotle. As a student of Plato, the man who studied everything from ethics to biology, logic to politics. For 3 years in the sanctuary of Mysa, Alexander, in a circle of noble youths trained under Aristotle's guidance, this was not simple education, it was the forging of a worldview. Aristotle taught Alexander the stories of the Homeric heroes, not as myths, but as blueprints for greatness. Achilles became more than a figure from the Iliad. He became Alexander's personal model of glory, discipline, and honor. Aristotle encouraged him to read deeply, to question the world, to understand the nature of power. Through these teachings, Alexander learned that war alone could not secure an empire. Philosophy, diplomacy, and cultural understanding would be the scaffolding that held his conquests together. The philosopher also shaped Alexander's view of the world itself. Aristotle believed in categories, hierarchies, and the rational organization of societies. He introduced Alexander to the idea of the civilized Greek and the barbarian foreign-era division that Alexander would later adopt, reject, and ultimately reshape in his own radical vision. Yet it was Aristotle's emphasis on logic and observation that taught Alexander to remain curious, adaptable, and hungry for knowledge. Historical accounts say that Alexander loved Aristotle, but also grew to resent him, leaving the philosopher favored his students' rivals. Nevertheless, the intellectual foundation was built. Alexander carried books into his campaigns, slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, and approached every new culture not simply as something to conquer, but as something to understand. The bond forged at Mysa would echo throughout Alexander's life. His desire to unify cultures, to blend Greek and Persian customs, and to explore the edges of the world was fueled not just by ambition, but by a philosophical curiosity Aristotle had lit inside him, the young warrior. Alexander in his first battles. Alexander's childhood was intellectual, but his adolescence was forged in blood. Philip believed a future king should learn war on the field, not in the safety of a palace. So at just 16, Alexander was left in charge of Macedonia, while Philip campaigned elsewhere. When a Thracian tribe rebelled, Alexander didn't hesitate. He marched out, crushed the uprising, founded his first city, Alexandropolis, and displayed a ruthlessness that shocked even seasoned soldiers. 2 years later came the battle that cemented his reputation, Chaeronea. 338 BCE. This was the great showdown between Philip's Macedonian army and an alliance of Athens and Thebes. Philip commanded the right wing. Alexander, still just 18, commanded the left. When the moment of crisis came, Alexander led his elite cavalry straight into the sacred band of Thebes, one of the most feared fighting units in Greece. He shattered them. His charge broke the enemy line and delivered victory. After Chaeronea, soldiers began whispering that Alexander fought with the speed of a god and the fury of a hero from legend. He trained relentlessly, mastering riding, swordsmanship, and the brutal coordination between phalanx, infantry, and cavalry that would later define his campaigns. Every scar he earned deepened the conviction that he was destined for more than ruling Macedonia. Philip may have been shaping Alexander into a weapon, but the young prince was also shaping his own legend. He refused to be overshadowed by his father's achievements, seeking glory in every campaign. Where Philip was calculating, Alexander was daring. Where Philip was cautious, Alexander was relentless. The young warrior was still learning, but already the world was beginning to see him not just as Philip's heir but as a force entirely his own. The assassination of Philip II, a kingdom in crisis. The death of Philip II is one of history's greatest mysteries, filled with jealousy, betrayal, and politics sharp enough to cut a king down. In 336 BCE, Philip was assassinated at Asia during his daughter's wedding, struck down by one of his own bodyguards, Pausanias. Theories swirl. Was it personal revenge? Conspiracy engineered by Olympias? A plot by Persia? or even a calculated move by Alexander himself? Ancient historians disagree, and modern scholars still debate the truth. What is absolutely certain is that the Macedonian court erupted into chaos the moment Philip fell. Rivals, claimants, and foreign powers all saw an opportunity. Alexander's legitimacy was far from guaranteed. He was young, his parents' relationship scandalous, and the nobles bristled with ambition. In a kingdom where kingship came from strength rather than divine right, hesitation meant death. Alexander did not hesitate. Within hours, he seized control of the royal guard. Within days, he eliminated potential rivals, cousins, generals, and even children who could have become figureheads for rebellion. Olympias moved swiftly as well, killing Philip's last wife and her infant daughter. It was brutal, bloody, and necessary. Macedonia respected only one currency: power proven through action. Foreign powers also tested him. Thracians, Illyrians, and Greek cities whispered that the kingdom might finally fracture. But Alexander moved with terrifying speed, riding north to crush revolts before the rebels had time to gather armies. His message was clear: the king was dead, but the kingdom was not weak. With the court stabilized and threats extinguished, Alexander emerged not as a boy who inherited a throne, but as a man who seized one. The 20-year-old king, securing the throne through fear and genius. At just 20 years old, Alexander had become king, but the throne he sat upon was still precarious. The Greek world hoped to break free from Macedonian dominance. The northern tribes sought revenge. Persia watched eagerly for a civil war. Alexander responded with a breathtaking display of both diplomacy and calculated terror. First, he secured loyalty at home, kept many of Philip's generals and advisors, but made it clear that loyalty to Philip did not guarantee loyalty to Alexander. He rewarded allies generously and punished dissent harshly. In meetings with nobles, he spoke with the authority of a man twice his age, convincing them that resistance was not only futile, but suicidal. Then he turned outward, launching lightning campaigns that stunned the ancient world. Marched into Thrace, crossing dangerous mountain passes and shattering uprisings before they became threats. He crushed Illyrian tribes with such decisive power that neighboring kingdoms immediately sent tributes rather than armies. His speed was legendary. He seemed to appear and disappear like a storm, but his greatest challenge lay in Greece. Thebes, Athens, and other city-states believed Macedonia would collapse without Philip. Alexander marched south at impossible speed, appearing near Thebes before they even believed he had left Macedonia. He demanded obedience with calm confidence, as if the outcome was already decided. When the Greek envoys saw him young, unyielding, and already victorious, they understood something profound. This was not Philip's son trying to hold a kingdom together. This was a king preparing to conquer the world, crushing the Greek rebellions, the burning of Thebes. When news of Philip's death spread across Greece, cities erupted in celebration. Athens rang its bells, Sparta sharpened its swords, Thebes, fierce, proud, and wounded from past defeats, saw its moment to escape Macedonian control. The Thebans rallied behind the rumor that Alexander had died in the northern campaigns, believing Macedonia leaderless. But their biggest mistake was not believing the rumor, it was believing Alexander would respond slowly. Instead, he marched over 300 miles in less than 2 weeks, a pace so brutal that even seasoned generals thought it impossible. Yet there he was, a 20-year-old king appearing at the gates of Thebes like a storm that materialized out of thin air. The Thebans were stunned, but they refused to surrender. They declared Alexander a tyrant, promising freedom to any Greek willing to join them. Their walls were strong, their warriors brave, and their conviction absolute. Alexander, however, had come not merely to defeat a rebellion, but to make a statement that would echo across the entire Greek world. Negotiations collapsed quickly, and Alexander unleashed his army. Macedonian siege crews battered the walls, lead infantry stormed breaches, companion cavalry carved through resistance. The final battle inside the city turned into chaos streets, choked with defenders, civilians, mercenaries, and Macedonian soldiers fighting house by house. When the last pockets of resistance fell, Alexander made the decision that would define his early reign: Thebes would be destroyed. The city was razed, its population slaughtered or enslaved, and its territory handed to rivals. But what mattered most was the message. In a single day, Alexander rewrote the political map of Greece. Cities that had once murmured about rebellion fell silent. Envoys from Athens and Corinth arrived offering peace. Even Sparta waited before daring to test him. In the ashes of Thebes, Alexander didn't just end a revolt, he cemented absolute dominance. The burning of Thebes was ruthless, calculated, and undeniably effective. Alexander proved he was not Philip's shadow, but a king capable of terrifying decisiveness. And as the smoke drifted across Greece, every ruler understood one truth: the age of rebellion was over. The age of Alexander had begun. Alexander crosses into Asia, a new world at war. With Greece subdued and Macedonia secure, Alexander turned toward a prize far greater than any Greek city, the vast Persian Empire. Richer and larger than anything the Greeks had ever imagined. Crossing into Asia was not just a military move, it was a symbolic declaration of world conquest. In the spring of 334 BCE, at the Hellespont, Alexander paused, hurled a spear into Asian soil, and proclaimed the land claimed by right of the sword. To him, this was destiny made real. The crossing itself was a spectacle. Tens of thousands of troops, horses, camp followers, supply wagons, engineers, and ships moved across the water in a coordinated wave of ambition. Alexander visited the legendary site of Troy, paying tribute to Achilles, confirming once more the heroic lineage he believed guided his life. His men felt the weight of history. They were not marching into a border skirmish, but into a war that would decide the fate of continents. Persia was not idle. Satraps, provincial governors near the coast gathered armies and planned to crush Alexander before he gained a foothold. These commanders believed the Macedonians young, untested, and reckless. But Alexander moved with the precision of a man who had studied every inch of the coastline, every strategic pass, every potential ally. He won over Greek cities in Asia Minor, promising freedom from Persian rule, and their ports became supply bases. Where diplomacy worked, he used it. Where defiance remained, he prepared for battle. Alexander's first real test would come at the river Granicus, where Persian cavalry blocked his path. The Macedonian army was outnumbered, outpositioned, and at a tactical disadvantage. The water was deep, the banks steep, and the Persian nobles waited on horseback, ready to cut down any man who tried to cross. Alexander's advisors urged caution, wait, maneuver, seek better ground. Alexander refused. He would not enter Asia with hesitation. He would enter with thunder. The Battle of Granicus, Alexander's first great gamble. The sun glinted off armor as the Macedonian phalanx formed by the river's edge. The Persian cavalry lined the opposite bank, armored and confident. They expected Alexander to wait or retreat. Instead, Alexander formed his cavalry into a wedge and prepared to charge upstream, into the current directly toward the enemy. It was madness, unless it worked. The moment the signal sounded, Macedonian cavalry plunged into the river. Horses struggled against the current, shields lifted over their heads as arrows rained down. But Alexander was already in front, pushing ahead, the first man to reach the enemy line. His presence electrified the troops. His recklessness terrified the Persians. As soon as he crested the bank, Persian nobles hurled themselves at him. The battlefield devolved into a brutal melee, blades clashing at arm's length, armor denting, mud splashing, horses screaming. Alexander himself was nearly killed. A Persian noble raised a blade to strike his exposed head, and at the last instant, Cletus, the Black Alexander's trusted friend, cut the attacker down. It was a moment that reinforced Alexander's divine confidence in his soldiers' devotion. They believed the gods protected him. He fought as if he believed it too. Once Alexander gained a foothold on the bank, the phalanx poured across. Sarsis long Macedonian pikes punched into charging cavalry. Infantry secured the rising ground. The enemy line collapsed under relentless pressure. The Persians retreated, leaving the field littered with their dead nobles. Alexander had not only won, he had destroyed the prestige of the Persian elite cavalry. The victory sent shockwaves through the region. Cities surrendered in fear or admiration. Satraps reconsidered their loyalty. Alexander gained treasure, horses, political leverage, and momentum. Most importantly, his men now believed that no obstacle, no matter how suicidal, was beyond their king's reach. Thought Granicus, Alexander proved the most dangerous truth about himself. He would risk everything, even his own life, if it meant victory, and somehow it worked. The Siege of Halicarnassus. Strategy versus stone. Halicarnassus was no ordinary city. It was a Persian stronghold, fortified by towering walls, defended by experienced mercenaries. Supplied from the sea and commanded by the ruthless Memnon of Rhodes, one of the few generals the Persians had who truly understood how dangerous Alexander was. This wasn't a city Alexander could intimidate or overwhelm with speed. This would be one of the hardest sieges of his career. The defenders launched surprise attacks, set fire to siege towers, and used catapults mounted on the walls to hurl stones heavier than grown men. Every night, Memnon struck with sudden raids, trying to destroy Alexander's siege works while they were still under construction. The Macedonian troops, unaccustomed to urban warfare, found themselves trapped in narrow alleys and ambushed from rooftops. It became a battle of attrition stone, grinding against steel, fire against tactics. Alexander responded with relentless discipline. Engineers rebuilt what Memnon destroyed. Archers were placed to counter rooftop snipers. Siege towers crept forward inch by inch, protected by densely packed shields. At one point, a surprise attack opened a massive breach in the wall, and Macedonian troops poured inside only to be met with a fierce counterattack that almost engulfed them. The fighting was so close that neither side could use arrows. It was sword on shield, shield on bone. In the end, Memnon realized the city could not hold forever. Under cover of darkness, he evacuated key troops and set parts of the city ablaze. Alexander entered Halicarnassus, not as a conqueror of triumph, but as a commander who had survived a grueling chess match. The siege taught him a lesson that would define the rest of his campaign. Persia would not fall easily. The empire still had teeth, but he had cracked a major fortress on the road down the coast now lay open. Marching down the coast, cities that welcomed or defied him. After Halicarnassus, Alexander moved along the coastline of Asia Minor, aiming to strip Persia of its naval bases. His strategy was brilliantly simple. Take the coastal cities, and Persia's navy, no matter how large, would have no ports left to use. Some cities surrendered peacefully, eager to throw off Persian rule. Others resisted fiercely, believing Alexander a passing storm. Ephesus welcomed him as a liberator, cheering his arrival and pulling down Persian statues. Here, Alexander displayed a political genius many did not yet recognize. He restored democratic institutions, canceled debts imposed by previous satraps, and gained a loyal ally without shedding a drop of blood. He was learning that conquest wasn't only about the sword, it was about reputation. Other cities, such as Miletus, resisted. Persian fleets hovered offshore trying to intervene, but Alexander blockaded the harbor and cut the city off. Even when reinforcements threatened to trap him between land and sea, Alexander held his ground, forcing a surrender through calculated pressure instead of annihilation. His control of the coast grew, and Persian influence shrank with every passing week. At Halicarnassus, he had been a warrior. Along the coast, he became a strategist. But more importantly, Alexander began shaping an image, a liberator of Greeks. A commander who rewarded loyalty, and a ruler who punished resistance without hesitation. His legend spread faster than his armies. Villages and towns along the coast sent envoys begging to avoid war. Many chose submission over destruction. And with every surrender, Alexander tightened the noose around Persia. The Battle of Issus, facing Darius III for the first time. When Alexander reached the city of Issus, he expected Darius III, the great king of Persia, be hundreds of miles away. Instead, Darius made an unexpected move. He marched behind Alexander and trapped the Macedonian army between the mountains and the sea. For the first time, the young Macedonian king faced the ruler of the largest empire in the known world. Darius brought with him an army that dwarfed Alexander's, tens of thousands of infantry. Archers, cavalry, and mercenaries filled the narrow plain beside the river Panaris. The Persian king sat atop a throne mounted on a chariot, surrounded by banners fluttering with gold. He believed victory was certain. To him, Alexander was a young pretender who had gotten lucky. But the narrow terrain that Darius chosen tended to trap Alexander did the opposite. It neutralized the Persian numerical advantage. Alexander's smaller, highly trained army found itself in perfect fighting ground. As the battle began, Persian arrows darkened the sky. Alexander led the companion cavalry on the right flank, aiming directly for the Persian center. The phalanx marched forward in perfect rhythm, Ceresus leveled, locking the battlefield into a deadly grid of spear points and shields. The fighting was brutal. The river water ran red as Macedonian troops pushed forward inch by inch. Alexander himself spotted Darius in his chariot and made a direct charge toward him. Reckless, audacious move that shattered Persian morale. Seeing Alexander's determined advance and fearing encirclement, Darius turned his chariot and fled. The moment the king broke, the Persian army collapsed. Issus was not just a victory, it was a humiliation for the Persian king. Alexander gained treasure, momentum, territory, and something more valuable: the psychological dominance that would shadow Darius for the rest of the war, capturing the royal family, mercy or propaganda. After the Battle of Issus, Alexander captured something more shocking than riches: the Persian royal family. Darius's mother, wife, and daughters were found in his abandoned camp, terrified and grieving, believing Alexander would execute them as trophies of war. In Persian culture, loss of the royal women was a catastrophic symbol of defeat. But Alexander did something unexpected. He treated them with dignity, allowing them to keep their status, possessions, and household staff. He personally assured them that they were safe and would be honored as if Darius himself were present. This act spread through the empire like wildfire. Was it mercy? Was it propaganda? Was it psychological warfare? It was all three. Alexander understood that sparing the royal women would shame Darius far more than killing them. A true king, in the Persian worldview, never let his family fall into enemy hands. By treating them better than Darius had been able to, Alexander presented himself as the rightful ruler of Asia. For the Greek world, the act was praised as noble restraint. For Persia, it was a devastating blow to royal legitimacy. And for Alexander's army, it was proof that their king was not merely a conqueror, but a man shaping an empire with the authority of a god and the strategy of a master. The capture of the royal family cemented a myth. Alexander was destined not just to defeat Persia, he was destined to replace it. Tyre, the impossible siege. Tyre was a problem unlike any Alexander had ever faced. A fortified island city nearly a kilometer offshore, surrounded by deep waters and defended by massive stone walls rising straight out of the sea, it was considered unconquerable. The Persians believed Tyre would halt Alexander's momentum. The Tyrians themselves, renowned sailors, laughed at the idea that a land army could touch them. For the first time, Alexander stood before a target he could not march toward. So he decided to build the land he needed. Alexander commanded his men to construct a massive causeway, a stone highway, stretching from the mainland to the island. Day after day, thousands of soldiers dumped debris, lumber, and earth into the sea. The Tyrians responded mercilessly. They launched fire ships, set siege engines ablaze, and rained arrows onto workers who struggled waist-deep in water. At one point, the Tyrian navy nearly burned the entire causeway, forcing Alexander to rebuild from rubble. But Alexander refused to retreat. He assembled fleets from conquered Phoenician cities and created his own navy on the spot. With ships, siege towers, and catapults mounted on platforms, he started attacking the walls directly. After 7 brutal months of storms, reinforcements, and relentless counterattacks, the Macedonians finally breached the walls. What followed was a street-by-street slaughter that echoed across the Mediterranean. Tyre had been impossible, but Alexander made it possible through sheer will. The siege became a symbol. The world began whispering that there was nothing the young Macedonian king could not achieve. The conquest of Gaza. The cost of resistance. After Tyre, Alexander marched south toward Egypt, but Gaza blocked the path. Built on a high mound with thick fortifications, Gaza was Persia's last stronghold on the Mediterranean coast. Its commander Bades refused to surrender. He told Alexander that even if the gods descended from heaven, Gaza would not kneel. Alexander took that personally. Gaza's elevated position made siege towers nearly useless, so engineers constructed new ones taller than any they had ever built. Still, Persian defenses inflicted heavy casualties. The city was protected by steep approaches and a network of underground tunnels that allowed defenders to appear behind Macedonian lines. Stone catapults hammered the approaching infantry. The desert sun turned every hour of work into an ordeal. Alexander himself was injured during the siege. An arrow pierced through his shoulder, lodging deep into the bone. But even while bleeding, he refused to halt operations. Every assault, every tower moved forward under his direct supervision. After weeks of relentless pressure, the Macedonians finally breached Gaza's walls. But unlike Tyre, Gaza's fate was harsher. Alexander's discipline cracked into fury. Batiste, the man who refused to bow, was captured alive. According to ancient sources, Alexander dragged him behind a chariot in imitation of Achilles and Hector. Whether mythologized or real, the act showed a dark side of the young king. Mercy could be diplomatic, but defiance brought annihilation. Gaza fell, and with it, the last Persian barrier between Alexander and Egypt crumbled. Entering Egypt, the god-king arrives. Egypt welcomed Alexander as a liberator. For centuries, Egyptians had resented Persian rule, believing the Achaemenids disrespected their temples and mocked their gods. When Alexander entered Memphis, priests, nobles, and commoners all lined the streets as if greeting a pharaoh reborn. They crowned him not as conqueror, but as king of Upper and Lower Egypt. Unlike other rulers, Alexander understood the symbolic power of religion. He participated in sacred ceremonies, offered sacrifices to local gods, and restored privileges to Egyptian temples. Rumors spread that he was the son of Amen, the supreme Egyptian deity, echoing the whispers from Greece that he was fathered by Zeus. Egyptians did not resist this narrative. In their worldview, kings often possessed divine blood. Alexander's arrival reshaped Egyptian politics instantly. He reinstated local governance, re-established traditional cults, and ordered massive constructions. His presence in Egypt marked a rare moment in his campaign. There was no major battle, no rebellion, no defiance. Everywhere he went, he was celebrated. For Alexander, Egypt was a message to the world. A new universal king had arrived, one who could conquer by force or by faith. The Oracle of Siwa, Alexander's divine identity. One of the most mysterious events in Alexander's life was his journey across the vast Sahara to the Oracle of Siwa. The temple was located deep in the desert, sacred to the god Amen, and famous for granting revelations to only the most powerful rulers. No Macedonian or Greek before Alexander had ever dared such a pilgrimage. The journey nearly killed him. His soldiers marched through scorching sands where wind erased footprints within seconds. Water sources dried unexpectedly. At one point, a sandstorm blinded the army, and only by following birds or by some miracle did they reach the oasis alive. Ancient writers later embellished the journey with supernatural sign snakes guiding the way. Storms parting, but whatever the truth, the trek became myth. When Alexander entered the sanctuary, no written record survives of what the oracle told him. Ancient authors only imply one thing. The priests addressed him not as a king but as the son of a god. Some say the oracle confirmed he was the son of Zeus Ammon. Others say the oracle simply spoke ambiguously, allowing Alexander's legend to grow. But Alexander emerged from Siwa changed. He began adopting divine titles, wearing symbolic horns of Amen in iconography, and acting with an even greater sense of destiny. Whether he believed himself divine or merely found it politically useful, the effect was undeniable. The world didn't just see Alexander as a conqueror anymore. It saw him as a chosen being, someone destined to rule not by birth, but by divine decree. Founding Alexandria, the city that outlived empires. Before leaving Egypt, Alexander made one of his most enduring decisions. He founded a city on the Mediterranean coast, Alexandria, a future beacon of culture, trade, and learning. The chosen site was perfect: a sheltered harbor, access to the Nile, and a strategic position linking Africa, Asia, and Europe. Alexander personally outlined the city's design, tracing lines in the sand with his spear streets, markets, temples, the royal district, and the great harbor. He envisioned Alexandria not just as a port, but as a symbol of fusion Greek intellect blended with Egyptian tradition, a crossroads of civilizations. The city would later house the Great Library, the Lighthouse of Pharos, and become the intellectual capital of the ancient world. Yet at this moment, It was only a dream sketched by a king who was already thinking centuries ahead. Alexandria was more than a city. It was Alexander's attempt at immortality. Empires might fall, kings might die, but a city that shaped the world that was eternal, preparing for the final showdown with Persia. With Egypt secure, Alexander turned his gaze eastward. Darius III still ruled from the heart of Persia, gathering armies, rebuilding strength, and sending envoys offering peace. Darius promised gold, territory, even his daughter's hand in marriage. But Alexander rejected every offer. He didn't want peace. He wanted Asia. Alexander reorganized his forces, bringing in fresh recruits from Greece, new Egyptian auxiliaries and engineers who had proven themselves at Tyre and Gaza. Supply lines were tightened. Fleets were positioned. The army was now a disciplined war machine, hardened by sieges, deserts, and impossible victories. As he marched eastward through Phoenicia and Syria, he proclaimed to every satrap and governor, "Submit or be erased." Many surrendered instantly, knowing resistance was suicide. Yet whispers spread that Darius was assembling a force unlike anything seen before, a massive army larger than Isis, larger than Granicus, larger than anything Alexander had ever faced. The world held its breath. 2 kings, 2 empires, one inevitable clash. The stage was set for Gaugamela. The Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander's greatest victory. Gaugamela was not a battle, it was destiny sculpted in dust. On an open plain chosen by Darius himself, the Persian king assembled an army so vast that ancient writers struggled to count it. Chariots with scything blades, Indian war elephants, cavalry from every corner of the empire. This was not just a military force, but a display of Persian supremacy. Darius ordered the ground leveled to give his chariots speed. Every detail of this battlefield was engineered to destroy Alexander. But Alexander was not intimidated. He was inspired, spent the night before the battle sleeping, while his generals anxiously prepared. To him, this was not just war. It was the moment he would seize Asia. As dawn broke, the Macedonian phalanx stood like a wall of iron, the cavalry shimmering like a blade waiting to strike. Alexander's plan was audacity itself. Bait the Persian army into stretching its left flank, then break through with a perfectly timed cavalry charge. The battle began with thunder. Persian chariots rushed forward, but Alexander had prepared a simple counter. Open the phalanx, let the chariots pass through, kill the horses from behind. The real contest was on the wings, where cavalry clashed in clouds of dust. As Darius committed his forces wider and wider, Alexander saw his opening and hurled himself into the gap. Macedonian cavalry struck like lightning at the heart of the Persian line. Darius fled. Panic rippled across the colossal army. Once the king ran, the battle was over in all but name. The mighty Persia, ruler of continents, collapsed before a man not yet 30 years old. Gaugamela was not just a victory. It was the moment Alexander became Alexander, the great master of the known world. The fall of Babylon, entering the Gate of Kings. After Gaugamela, Alexander marched into Babylon, the beating heart of the ancient East. Unlike Tyre or Gaza, Babylon did not resist. Its people greeted Alexander with golden crowns, flowers, incense, and music. The city gates opened without a single drop of blood shed. For the first time, Alexander didn't win through violence. He won through power, image, and inevitability. Babylon was no ordinary city. It was a place of legendary wealth, cigarettes reaching toward the heavens, gardens rumored to hang in the air, temples thick with incense. Priests welcomed Alexander as the liberator who restored old rights stripped by Persian kings. He ordered the rebuilding of temples, honored local gods like Marduk, and listened to Babylonian astronomers as if they were equals to Greek philosophers. His soldiers wandered through markets overflowing with spices, gold, jewels, silk, rare animals, luxuries many had never imagined. But Alexander did not settle or rest. In Babylon, he was planning his next move, the march deeper into Persia's core. Babylon gave him legitimacy, authority, the sense that conquest was not just war but transformation. Here, he began wearing Persian garments in publica, choice his Macedonian companions feared. But Alexander understood something deeper. To rule Asia, one had to become Asian in the eyes of its people. Babylon became the first chapter of this new identity. Susa and Persepolis, the heart of Persian power. Susa was a treasure chest disguised as a city. When Alexander entered, he found vaults containing gold, silver, and jewels collected over 2 centuries. The Macedonians were stunned. Wealth beyond imagination was piled in mountains payment for armies, alliances, and perhaps even the rest of the campaign. Alexander did not loot Susa like a barbarian. Instead, he declared himself the rightful heir to Persia's throne and took the treasure as a king would. From Susa, he marched toward Persepolis, the sacred city of Persia, the ceremonial capital of kings. The road was treacherous and heavily defended. Persian loyalists launched ambushes, burned bridges, and attempted to block the mountain passes. But nothing slowed the Macedonian engine. In a dramatic winter march, Alexander personally led attacks through snow-covered cliffs. Persepolis surrendered reluctantly, but its symbolism was undeniable. This was the home of Achaemenid kings, the birthplace of imperial glory, and gazed at the throne of kings who ruled from Egypt to India. Here he understood the true magnitude of what he had conquered. Greece had been a battleground. Persia was an empire. Burning Persepolis, revenge or drunken madness. The burning of Persepolis remains one of history's greatest controversies. After a night of heavy drinking, Alexander and his companions, Greek courtesans, among them wandered through the palace halls. Someone, perhaps the courtesan Tyre, suggested burning the palace as revenge for Xerxes burning Athens 150 years earlier. Whether Alexander acted from fury, symbolism, or intoxication, the result was catastrophic. Torches were hurled against golden curtains. Flames licked upward, consuming centuries of Persian art, records, and majesty. The fire spread so rapidly that even Alexander later tried to stop it, but the city that had once embodied Persian glory became a mountain of smoldering ash. Some historians believe Alexander regretted his decision, realizing too late that he had destroyed the heart of an empire he meant to rule. Others argue the act was calculated an announcement to the world that Persia's age was over and a new ruler had risen. Whatever the motive, the burning of Persepolis was a turning point. Alexander's conquests had been forged in fire, but this fire revealed something else. He was no longer just a Macedonian king. His actions were becoming unpredictable, shaped by ambition, rage, and the intoxicating power of conquering worlds. Hunting Darius, the king who wouldn't stop running. With Persepolis in ashes, Alexander pursued Darius III across the vast Persian interior. He wanted closer symbolic confirmation that Persia had fallen, but Darius refused to face him again. He fled deeper into the empire, trying to rally support from eastern satraps and tribal leaders. Alexander's pursuit became legendary. His army crossed deserts, mountains, and barren plains at relentless speed. Cities surrendered instantly just to avoid being crushed underfoot. Alexander sent letters to Darius urging him to stop running, even offering respectful terms if he surrendered alive. But Darius was a king bound by pride. He believed surrender was worse than death. As Alexander pushed deeper into Central Asia, he learned that Darius was not fleeing toward safety, but toward betrayal. His own satrap Bessus planned to overthrow him and claim the Persian throne.
Alexander raced desperately, trying to reach Darius before his own men murdered him.
This was no longer war. It was a chase between two kings whose fates had become intertwined. For Alexander, capturing Darius alive meant legitimacy. For Darius, staying alive meant dignity. But destiny had other plans. The death of Darius III. Murder, loyalty, and opportunism. Alexander finally reached Darius, but too late. Deep in the desert, he found the Persian king dying in a crude wagon, stabbed by his own officers, who had abandoned him moments earlier. The great king who once commanded an empire had been reduced to a fugitive, murdered by traitors. Alexander knelt beside Darius, lifting the dying king's head onto his chest. According to the sources, Darius asked for water, thanked Alexander for his attempted mercy, and pleaded that his family be protected. Alexander responded with an oath. Darius's children would be safe, his mother honored, and he would receive a burial fit for a king. But Alexander's grief was complicated. With Darius dead, his dream of defeating Persia through a king-to-king confrontation was lost. Yet with Darius gone, Alexander became the uncontested ruler of Asia, he hunted Bessus ruthlessly, capturing him months later and executing him as a traitor to the Persian throne, not as a Macedonian prisoner, but as a Persian murderer. By honoring Darius and punishing his killers, Alexander sent a message. He was not Persia's destroyer, he was Persia's new king. The ancient world had never seen anything like him. Alexander becomes king of Asia. With Darius dead, Alexander stood at the crossroads of identity and destiny. In the eyes of Persia, the throne was now empty, and the rightful heir was the man who had avenged their murdered king. Alexander seized the title King of Asia, not as a Greek conqueror, but as the inheritor of an empire stretching from the Mediterranean to the foothills of India. It was no longer enough to be king of Macedon. He claimed a cosmic throne built over 2 centuries of Persian rule, yet power of this scale required more than swords, it demanded legitimacy. Alexander held state ceremonies in the Persian tradition, sat upon the royal throne, and issued declarations in the style of the Achaemenid kings. He adopted royal titles in multiple languages and took the place of Darius in religious rituals. These acts shocked his Macedonian commanders, who feared he was losing himself to foreign customs. But Alexander was not losing identity, he was expanding it. To cement his rule, he began integrating Persians into his administration. Satraps were replaced only when disloyal. Persian nobles retained their prestige. Local customs were protected. Alexander understood something his generals could not. You cannot rule Asia by crushing its soul, you must absorb it. And so, Alexander became a king unlike any other, a hybrid monarch who walked between worlds. But with this new role came a shift in temperament. He began expecting obedience without question, reverence as though he were divine. For the first time, Alexander was not just a brilliant commander. He was acting like a man who believed destiny had marked him for greatness beyond mortal kings. The conquest of Persia was complete. The transformation of Alexander had only just begun. The Persian court adopts a Macedonian king. Taking the Persian throne brought privilege but also pressure. The Persian court was a massive, sophisticated bureaucracy, with traditions far older than Macedonia itself. When Alexander entered it, he entered a world of rigid etiquette, elaborate ceremonies, and expectations of godlike majesty. To rule Persia, he had to become Persian at least in the eyes of its people. He began wearing the Persian royal robe, a gesture that infuriated many Macedonians. To them, it symbolized submission to a defeated enemy. To Persians, however, it meant continuity, stability, and respect. Alexander also adopted the long-standing custom of proskynos's bowing to the king, which Macedonians refused to perform, seeing it as worship fit only for a god.
Alexander backed down on forcing them.
But the tension lingered. Slowly, the Persian nobles began to accept him as their rightful ruler. Many even preferred him to Darius, who had been distant and often absent from court life. Alexander met with poets, astronomers, priests, and scholars. He upheld Persian religious festivals and funded restorations of temples destroyed in past wars. This was not a conqueror mocking his prize. It was a new monarch weaving himself into the fabric of an empire. But this cultural fusion brought internal strain. Macedonian veterans muttered that their king was going native. Persian nobles whispered about his unifying vision. A court where Greek, Macedonian, Persian, and Asian elites mingled as equals. In trying to build harmony, Alexander ignited jealousy on both sides. The Persian court adapted to its new king, but the Macedonian king was changing even faster. The march into Central Asia. If conquering Persia was difficult, ruling it was even harder. Rebellions erupted in the far provinces Bactria, Sogdia, and the lands that now lie in modern Afghanistan and Tajikistan. These regions were a rugged maze of mountains, deserts, and tribal strongholds. No empire had fully controlled them, not even the mighty Persians. Alexander marched east to finish what he started, but he soon discovered that Central Asia was a world unlike anything he'd faced. The march was brutal. The terrain was unforgiving. Cliffs that ripped sandal and hoof, river crossings swollen with melting snows, deserts where entire divisions struggled to find water. The tribes of these regions, Scythians, Bactrians, Sogdians, were masters of guerrilla warfare. They struck from caves and hilltops, vanished into mountains, and refused open battle.
Yes.
For the first time in his campaign, Alexander could not rely solely on pitched battles and shock tactics. He adapted ruthlessly. He built forts, settled colonies, cut supply lines of rebellious tribes, and used siege tactics, even in mountain passes. He learned to counter guerrilla attacks by deploying mobile units that responded rapidly to ambushes. At night, Macedonians slept in armor. Fires were tightly controlled. Scouts patrolled constantly. Alexander also founded new cities, Alexandria, the furthest Alexandria being the most famous in an attempt to secure permanent control over the region. These cities planted Greek culture into the mountains like seeds that would last for centuries. But even these measures were not enough to tame the wild lands. Central Asia didn't simply resist him, it reshaped him. The Sogdian campaign, the most difficult war. The campaign in Sogdia became the greatest test of Alexander's military genius and his endurance. Led by fierce warlords like Spitamenes, the Sogdians fought with an adaptability and resilience Macedonia had never encountered. They used the terrain as a weapon, narrow passes that funneled troops, sheer cliffs impossible to scale, hidden paths known only to locals. Alexander's forces were stretched thin. Supplies from Persia arrived slowly. Horses died from exhaustion. Even the elite companion cavalry sometimes found themselves trapped in tight ravines where their speed and shock tactics were useless. Slaughtering small garrisons and vanishing into remote valleys before Alexander could respond. To counter this, Alexander turned the region into a massive chessboard. He divided his army into multiple roaming columns, each hunting rebels, securing supply lines, and building outposts. He brought in engineers to construct fortified towns in impossible locations. He even recruited local fighters to act as scouts and guides, a sign of his flexibility and desperation. Alexander was no longer fighting armies, he was fighting shadows. The Sogdian Rock, an enormous fortress perched on a sheer cliff, became a symbol of this struggle. The defenders taunted Alexander, claiming he would need men with wings to take it. In response, he ordered his best climbers trained in difficult mountain warfare to scale the cliff at night. At dawn, the defenders awoke to Macedonians standing behind them. The fortress fell without a fight. But the cost of this campaign went beyond blood. It changed Alexander. The endless resistance hardened him, made him more ruthless, more demanding, and less tolerant of dissent. Somewhere in the mountains of Sogdia, the brilliant young king began turning into the unstoppable. Uncompromising emperor history remembers Roxana, love, politics, and the Sogdian Rock. Roxana entered Alexander's life not as a courtly bride, but as a prize of war yet. She became far more than that. Where Alexander had pulled off the impossible by scaling sheer cliffs at night, Roxana was among those surrendered to him. Chroniclers describe her as the most beautiful woman in Asia, but beauty alone was not what captivated Alexander. She was the daughter of a powerful Sogdian noble, symbol of everything the region represented: resistance, pride, and cultural identity. By marrying her, Alexander was not just taking a wife, he was binding Central Asia to his empire. The marriage shocked his Macedonian generals, who expected him to take a Greek or Macedonian bride. Instead, Alexander performed the ceremony in the local tradition, eating from a shared loaf of bread with Roxana, symbolizing unity. It was a political masterstroke. Suddenly, rebellious tribes saw Alexander not merely as a conqueror, but as family. And Roxana herself was no passive figure. She understood the stakes of their union and carried herself with intelligence and influence. But this marriage also introduced new tensions. Macedonians whispered that Alexander was abandoning his heritage. Persians and Sogdians watched to see if he would treat Roxana with true honor or use her as political decoration. Alexander defied both groups. He placed her beside him, gave her status, and allowed her a voice seldom granted to foreign wives. Their relationship softened Alexander's edges in small ways. But it also drew him further from the Macedonians, who felt his empire no longer belonged to them. Roxana became a bridge between two worlds, but a bridge that widened the divide within Alexander's own ranks. In the shadows of the Sogdian cliffs, Alexander found love, alliance, and the beginning of a dynasty he would never see completed. The warrior queen Spitamenes, Alexander's most dangerous enemy. Among all Alexander's enemies, Persian kings, Indian war elephants, Greek rebels, none earned his respect. Fear and frustration, like Spitamenes, the brilliant Sogdian commander who led a near-perfect guerrilla war. While Darius fled, Spitamines fought. While Persian satraps surrendered cities, Spitamines fired rebellions into a blaze. He was not a king, but a warrior chieftain, and he understood the land in ways Alexander never could. Spitamines avoided open battle and relied on ambushes, raids, and swift horse archers who struck with terrifying accuracy before vanishing into the steppe. His attacks were not random, they were psychological. He struck Alexander's supply lines, isolated garrisons, and exploited the Macedonians' exhaustion. At one point, Spitamines annihilated an entire Macedonian force of over 2,000 men, something no other commander had achieved. Alexander was forced to change the way he fought. He split his army into roaming detachments, built fortified towns, and hunted Spitamines like a ghost across mountains and deserts. But even as Alexander adapted, Spitamines stayed ahead. The campaign dragged on for years, draining morale and pushing the army to its limits. In the end, it was betrayal, not battle, that killed Spitamines. His own allies, afraid of Alexander's growing wrath, murdered him and sent his severed head to the Macedonian camp. When it arrived, Alexander did not celebrate. Some sources say he wept. Others say he honored the fallen warrior with a funeral worthy of a king. Spitamines was more than an enemy. He was the mirror of what Alexander could have been if born among the steppes. Fierce, unbowed, and unwilling to kneel to any empire. Founding cities across the edge of the world. Wherever Alexander marched, cities sprang up behind him. Some were military outposts, others trade hubs, and a few became great metropolises that outlived countless kingdoms. More than 20 cities bore his name, Alexandria in Egypt being the most famous, but others, such as Alexandria Aschaeth, the furthest, anchored Greek culture at the fringes of the known world. These cities served several purposes. Militarily, they secured supply routes, protected conquered territories, and acted as bases for future expansion. Economically, they became centers of trade connecting Greece, Persia, Central Asia, and India. Culturally, they acted as seeds of Hellenization, blending local traditions with Greek architecture, language, and arts. Alexander's dream was not to erase cultures, but to merge them into a cosmopolitan identity. The design of these cities reflected that vision. They had marketplaces, theaters, temples built in hybrid styles, and garrisons that housed both Greeks and locals. Veterans of Alexander's army were often settled there, marrying local women and creating societies where East met West. Greek ideas spread through these cities like wildfire: mathematics, philosophy, civic governance, but so did Asian customs, foods, religions, and languages. But founding cities also created resentment. Many locals feared Greek colonization. Macedonian soldiers sometimes resisted being settled in far-off lands instead of returning home. Still, Alexander pushed forward, convinced that cities, not battles, would secure his legacy. In the end, these cities became the true backbone of his empire. Long after Alexander was gone, long after kingdoms rose and fell, the cities he founded continued to shape the world, from the Silk Road to the Roman Empire. The bloodbath at Massaga, brutality or strategy. The siege of Massaga in present-day Pakistan marks one of the darkest and most debated moments of Alexander's campaign. The city's defenders were fierce warriors from the Aspasui and Assakanoi tribes, experienced fighters who refused to submit. Their fortress was built on high cliffs, heavily fortified, and manned by thousands of trained soldiers, including women who took up arms when their men fell. Alexander expected resistance, but not a bloodbath. The battle raged day and night. The defenders fought with suicidal courage, hurling rocks, arrows, and fire down the steep slopes. Alexander himself was injured by an arrow that pierced his ankle. Every assault cost Macedonian lives, and Alexander's patience thinned. When the walls finally fell after days of brutal fighting, the defenders attempted a desperate night escape. Alexander's forces intercepted them, and the slaughter that followed was merciless. Some ancient sources claim that Alexander ordered the massacre of the city's surviving warriors. Others argue he merely acted within the brutal norms of ancient warfare. Regardless, the destruction of Massaga sent a clear message. Resistance would be met with annihilation. For many later historians, this episode tarnishes the legend of Alexander the Great. For ancient generals, it was evidence of his unforgiving efficiency. But the bloodshed had a strategic dimension. Alexander was deep in foreign territory, far from home, surrounded by hostile tribes. If Massaga had been left unconquered, other cities would rise against him. By crushing it absolutely, Alexander ensured the surrounding regions submitted quickly. Massaga was victory, but a victory paid for in shadows. And it pushed Alexander one step closer to the ruthlessness that defined his final years. Crossing the Hindu Kush, a march through hell. The Hindu Kush was not a mountain range. It was a wall built by the gods themselves. Snowstorms swallowed entire brigades, winds sliced through armor like knives, and the thin air turned every breath into agony. Ouch. Alexander's men had already marched thousands of miles, but the Hindu Kush broke even the strongest among them. Horses slipped and tumbled into bottomless ravines. Soldiers woke with frostbitten fingers and blackened feet. Some froze to death in their sleep. Others simply sat down in the snow and never stood again. Alexander, however, refused comfort. He marched on foot alongside his men, sharing their misery, lifting those who collapsed, pushing others forward with relentless resolve. The sight of their king in rags, face frostburned, during the same torment they did, kept the army moving when logic said they should turn back. But Alexander wasn't crossing mountains. He was crossing the boundary between the world he knew and the world he dreamed of conquering. At times, the only way forward was to carve steps into ice with axes or crawl along narrow paths while avalanches thundered in the distance. Supplies ran dangerously low. Men boiled leather straps for food, yet Alexander pushed on, convinced that the lands beyond the peaks, Indio held his destiny. The mountains became a crucible that stripped away weakness and left only grim determination. When they finally descended into the plains of the Indus, gaunt and bleeding but alive, Alexander did not rest. He gazed eastward, toward lands his ancestors had never even conceived of, and declared that the world itself was finally within reach. The army knew the horrors of the Hindu Kush were only the beginning. The Battle of the Hydaspes, war against King Porus, the Hydaspes River glimmered under monsoon clouds as Alexander faced one of the most formidable kings he had ever encountered, Porus, the giant monarch who ruled the land with pride, honor, and an army unlike anything the Macedonians had seen. War elephants towering, armored beasts formed a terrifying front line. Soldiers described them as moving fortresses, each carrying archers, spearmen, and tusks capped with iron blades. Alexander could not simply charge. The river was swollen, the banks treacherous, and Porus watched every move. So Alexander employed deception. Under darkness and thunder, he made repeated false marches up and down the riverbank until Porus believed crossing was impossible. Then, during a violent storm, Alexander slipped across with a strike force. The shock was total, but Porus responded instantly, driving his war elephants straight into the Macedonian ranks. The battle that followed was chaos, unlike anything Alexander's army had endured. Elephants crushed soldiers underfoot, hurled men into the air, and broke the Macedonian phalanx again and again. Horses panicked, entire squads were thrown into disarray, but Alexander adapted. He harried the elephants with javelins, targeted their mahouts, and slowly turned the tide. When the elephants finally panicked and trampled their own troops, Alexander seized victory. Porus, wounded and exhausted, was brought before him. Alexander asked the defeated king how he wished to be treated. Porus replied simply, like a king. Alexander was stunned and impressed. He restored Porus to power, granting him even more territory than he had lost. It was one of the few times Alexander met a rival worthy of his admiration. The Battle of Hydaspes was victory, but a victory stained with grief. Thousands died. Alexander's army, though triumphant, was shaken. And deep inside, Alexander knew the conquest of India would not be as easy as Persia. These lands fought differently, fiercer, stranger, more united, yet he still pressed onward. The mutiny at the Hydaspes. When his army broke, after Hydaspes, Alexander sought to push further east. He spoke of lands beyond the horizon, richer kingdoms, mightier rivers, a world waiting to kneel. But his army was done. Years of war had hollowed them out. Many had not seen Macedonia in over a decade. Their bodies bore wounds from 3 continents, their minds haunted by fallen friends. and their bellies filled with stories of even greater Indian empires ahead. At the Hydaspes River wide, sacred, shimmering under the sun, the army reached a breaking point. The men approached Alexander in silence, their armor dusty, their beards unshaven, and declared through their generals that they could march no farther. Alexander raged. He wept. He begged. He invoked Zeus. He told them they could return home, but never again be remembered as conquerors of the world. But the army stood firm, not in defiance but in exhaustion. They loved Alexander, but they were broken. And for the first time in his life, Alexander confronted a foe he could not defeat, the will of his own men. After days of solitude and fury, Alexander agreed to turn back, each one dedicated to a major god, symbolizing that he had reached the ends of the earth. His retreat was framed not as surrender, but as triumph. Yet Alexander never forgot this moment. The Hydaspes was the invisible wall where the greatest conqueror in history discovered that even he had limits because the men who carried him to glory did. The deadly march through the Gedrosian desert. Turning back from India did not mean safety. Alexander chose a route so hellish that even his generals questioned his sanity. The Gedrosian desert. A wasteland of rolling dunes, blistering winds, and salt plains where even birds refused to fly. Why he chose this path remains debated. Punishment for the mutiny. A test of loyalty, or simply a desire to achieve what no Persian king had survived. The desert swallowed the army. Temperatures rose so high that metal buckles burned through clothing. Water was rarer than gold. Men died of thirst only steps from the next dune. Others collapsed under sandstorms that tore tents apart and buried wagons. Supplies ran out. Horses, camels, servants, everything edible was consumed. The survivors walked through mountains of bones, remnants of caravans long dead. Alexander shared the suffering. When a small cup of water was brought to him, he poured it into the sand so his men would know he would not drink unless they did. Acts like this kept the army together, but barely. Over 10,000 soldiers perished, maybe more. Many said the desert was worse than any battle. When the survivors staggered out of the Gedrosian wasteland, they were ghosts. Alexander's empire still stood, but the price had been brutal. The march became a symbol of his obsession the moment his ambition turned from glory to madness. Babylon, the final plans for a new empire. When Alexander returned to Babylon, the city greeted him like a god. The streets overflowed with soldiers, nobles, priests, scholars, and ambassadors. Babylon's walls shimmered with banners, its gardens lush with impossible greenery. After years of war, Alexander finally envisioned peace, but not quiet peace. A global peace formed through unity, infrastructure, and vision. He planned new fleets to explore the Arabian Sea, new cities across Persia, massive trade networks stretching from Greece to India, and even intermarriage policies to blend cultures into one. He reorganized satrapies, trained new armies, and drafted grand blueprints for a world empire unlike anything humanity had ever imagined. But beneath the celebration, tensions smoldered. His generals felt overshadowed by Persian nobles. Macedonian veterans felt replaced by foreign soldiers. Court factions whispered that Alexander was becoming too Persian, wearing their robes, adopting their ceremonies, embracing their gods. Yet Alexander seemed unstoppable. He held feasts, festivals, and honored fallen soldiers. He met philosophers, mystics, engineers, and astronomers. His health appeared robust, his spirit unbroken. Then, suddenly he fell ill. Death of Alexander, poison, fever, or fate. Alexander's illness came swiftly and mysteriously. One evening, after a banquet, he developed a fever so intense that he could barely speak. Over the next days, he lost the ability to walk, then to stand, then even to whisper. His generals gathered around him as Babylon held its breath. Rumors exploded. Poison, divine punishment, exhaustion, a tropical disease from India, revenge from those he had wronged. For 11 agonizing days, Alexander lingered between life and death. Soldiers were allowed to file past him as he lay on his bed, unable to move but still able to raise his hand weakly in acknowledgement. Many wept, others prayed. Some refused to accept what they were seeing. Finally, he was asked the question that would shape history: To whom do you leave your empire? Alexander is said to have whispered, to the strongest. On June 10th, or 11th, 323 BCE, at just 32 years old, Alexander the Great died. His death shattered the world he built. His generals carved the empire into pieces. Roxana fought for her unborn son's future. Cities mourned. Legends formed. But one truth remained. Alexander's life burned so fiercely that thousands of years later, his shadow still falls across history. No conqueror, no king, no general ever matched the scale of his ambition or the immensity of his myth. And so, our journey ends where Alexander's story began, not with a kingdom, not with a crown, but with a dream so vast it outlived the man who created it. Alexander the Great marched farther than any king before him. He toppled empires, forged nations, crossed deserts, shattered armies, and carved his name into the bones of the earth. Yet in the end, he was still mortal and done, not by a blade or arrow, but by time, exhaustion, and fate itself. What makes Alexander truly unforgettable isn't just the lands he conquered, it's the world he envisioned. A world without borders, a world where cultures blended, a world where a Macedonian king could become pharaoh of Egypt, lord of Asia, and hero of the Hellenistic age. Even now, more than 2,000 years later, generals study his tactics. Historians debate his motives. Nations claim his legacy, and storytellers return to him again and again, because some lives burn too brightly to ever fade. Alexander did not simply change history. He became history. His empire collapsed, but his influence never did. His story ended, but his legend never will. And as we close this epic tale, one truth remains. There was only one Alexander, and the world has been chasing his shadow ever since. If you've made it this far, you're a legend yourself. If you want more deep cinematic explorations of ancient worlds, more forgotten empires, more dark histories, and more mythology brought to life, subscribe to the channel. Hit the bell so you never miss another epic journey. Comment below, was Alexander the greatest general in history, or just the most ambitious? I want to hear your thoughts. And if you enjoyed this video, give it a like. It helps this massive project reach more people who love history as much as you do. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving into the forbidden realms of history.